June 9th, 1944. Arromanches-les-Bains, Gold Beach, Normandy. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Richter stood in the shattered remains of his coastal observation post, binoculars pressed against his face, struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing 3,000 yards offshore. His 716th Infantry Division had fought desperately against the British landing 3 days earlier, inflicting casualties the enemy newspapers wouldn't report for weeks. Yet this was something entirely outside the scope of military doctrine he'd studied at the War Academy in Berlin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Enormous rectangular structures made of concrete rose from the channel, like the ruins of some drowned civilization being resurrected from the depths. Each one stood as tall as a 5-story apartment building in Hamburg, displacing thousands of tons, moving slowly toward predetermined positions with the methodical precision of an engineering operation that defied everything German intelligence had predicted about Allied capabilities. More disturbing still, these massive concrete caissons were being positioned in a formation that unmistakably formed a harbour, a complete artificial port emerging from nothing on an exposed coastline that possessed no natural harbour facilities whatsoever. Richter lowered his binoculars and reached for the field telephone connecting him to the 750th Infantry Division headquarters at Cruilly. His voice, trained through years of military discipline to remain calm under all circumstances, betrayed the first hints of profound confusion. "We are observing the enemy constructing what appears to be a complete harbour facility, using prefabricated concrete structures of enormous size," he reported to the duty officer. "They are building a port where no port exists. Request immediate clarification on whether intelligence services have any information about this capability." The response came back within 20 minutes. Berlin had no intelligence whatsoever suggesting the Allies possessed technology or engineering capacity to construct artificial harbours. The concrete structures Richter described were physically impossible to transport across open water. His report was filed as combat stress or optical confusion caused by the enormous volume of shipping offshore. 3 days later, when photographic reconnaissance finally confirmed Richter's initial observations, German High Command realized they were watching the deployment of technology that rendered obsolete 2 years of fortification, construction, and strategic planning. The certainty that no invasion could succeed without capturing a major port, the assumption that had shaped every defensive decision along the Atlantic Wall, was being systematically dismantled by an engineering solution German technical experts had never imagined possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Richter couldn't know as he watched those first Phoenix caissons being positioned was that this technology represented something far more profound than simple engineering innovation. The Mulberry harbours being assembled before his disbelieving eyes were the culmination of 2 years of desperate planning born from catastrophic failure. They embodied lessons written in blood on the beaches of Dieppe, lessons that had forced the Allies to reimagine the fundamental nature of amphibious warfare. And they would deliver to the Normandy beaches 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies, in numbers so staggering they would ensure Germany's defeat in the West was merely a matter of time. The story of how the Allies came to build harbours that could be towed across the English Channel begins not with triumph, but with disaster. August 19th, 1942. The French port of Dieppe. The morning sun revealed a scene of absolute carnage along 2 miles of blood-soaked shingle. Canadian soldiers lay dead on the beaches where German machine guns had caught them in murderous crossfire. Churchill tanks sat abandoned and burning, their tracks jammed with stones, unable to advance beyond the seawall. Bodies floated in the surf among wrecked landing craft that German artillery had methodically destroyed. Of the 6,000 men who had gone ashore that morning, 3,600 were dead, wounded, or captured within 6 hours. The raid had been a comprehensive disaster that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions. Yet from this catastrophe would emerge one insight that would fundamentally alter the course of the war. Vice Admiral John Hughes Hallett, one of the planners who had watched the disaster unfold from offshore, drew a conclusion that contradicted decades of military doctrine. Attempting to capture a heavily defended port through direct assault was not merely difficult, it was effectively impossible against determined resistance. The Germans had transformed every Channel port into a fortress: Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, all fortified beyond any reasonable hope of rapid capture through amphibious assault. This presented an apparently unsolvable problem for the invasion of Europe that Allied planners knew must eventually come. An amphibious invasion required a port, not just for the initial landing, but for sustained operations. Armies needed thousands of tons of supplies daily: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement vehicles, reinforcements, all had to flow continuously from ship to shore. Beach landings could deliver men and initial equipment, but maintaining a major campaign required port facilities. Deep water berths where large cargo vessels could unload directly onto piers, protected anchorages where ships could shelter from Channel storms, the infrastructure that took decades to develop in peacetime. The logic seemed ironclad. To invade France, the Allies needed to capture a major port, but capturing a defended port would cost casualties that might cripple the invasion before it began. And even if captured, the Germans would certainly demolish the port facilities before surrendering, rendering them useless for weeks or months while engineers attempted repairs. Hughes Hallett's radical suggestion, made in the weeks following Dieppe's failure, seemed like fantasy when first proposed. If ports cannot be captured, he wrote in a confidential memorandum to Combined Operations Headquarters, then perhaps we must bring our own ports with us. The idea was not entirely new. Winston Churchill himself had suggested portable harbours as early as 1917 during the First World War, though that concept never progressed beyond preliminary discussion. But the Dieppe disaster gave the concept urgent necessity. Some method had to be developed to supply invasion forces without depending on captured port facilities. The technical challenges were staggering. A harbour required breakwaters to protect ships from waves and storms. It needed deep water close to shore where large cargo vessels could anchor. It required piers and roadways allowing cargo to be transferred from ship to land quickly and efficiently. Creating all of this using portable, prefabricated components that could somehow be transported across open water seemed to violate basic engineering principles. The English Channel was not a calm lake. It was one of the world's most challenging bodies of water. Powerful tides that could exceed 20 feet in range, unpredictable weather that could generate gale-force winds with minimal warning, strong currents. Any structure operating in these conditions needed to be extraordinarily robust, yet it also needed to be transportable across those same challenging waters. The apparent contradiction seemed impossible to resolve. Winston Churchill, whose strategic imagination often exceeded practical constraints, became fascinated by the concept. In May 1942, he issued a memorandum to Combined Operations that would become famous for its combination of vision and vagueness. Piers for use on beaches, Churchill wrote. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. The Prime Minister's directive launched what would become one of the war's most ambitious engineering projects. But in summer 1942, as German forces pushed towards Stalingrad and Japanese armies threatened India, the idea of prefabricated portable harbours remained little more than an interesting concept without practical design or proven feasibility. The breakthrough began with understanding the true nature of the problem. A harbour needed to solve three fundamental challenges. First, protection from waves and storms through breakwaters. Second, stable anchorage for supply ships in all weather conditions. Third, roadways connecting ships to shore that could handle the 26-foot tidal range characteristic of the Normandy coast. Each element required different engineering solutions. For breakwaters, multiple concepts emerged. The simplest involved scuttling old ships in a protective line offshore. These block ships, codenamed gooseberries, could provide immediate shelter by creating a physical barrier against waves, but ships alone wouldn't provide sufficient protection for extended operations. Something more substantial was needed. The solution came from British engineers who proposed reinforced concrete caissons that could float when empty, be towed into position, then deliberately sunk to create a permanent barrier. These structures, eventually codenamed Phoenix breakwaters, would become the most spectacular element of the entire harbour concept. Each Phoenix caisson stood 60 feet tall, as long as a city block, wide enough to mount anti-aircraft guns on top for defending the harbour. When flooded and sunk, they would create an impenetrable wall against channel storms. The engineering challenges were immense. Concrete structures of this size had never been transported across open water. The caissons needed to be light enough to float with sufficient freeboard, yet strong enough to withstand both the towing journey and their eventual role as permanent breakwaters. They required internal compartments that could be selectively flooded to control sinking once in position. They needed to be produced in quantities that industrial Britain, already stretched desperately thin by war production, could barely imagine manufacturing. For the floating piers, engineer Alan Beckett designed a revolutionary system. Flexible steel roadways, codenamed Whales, would rest on floating pontoons called beetles. The roadways needed to flex and twist to accommodate waves while remaining strong enough to support Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons each. The design was elegant but unproven. No one had ever attempted creating floating roadways at this scale that could operate reliably in open ocean conditions. The final element involved pier heads, codenamed spuds, that could rise and fall with tides while remaining stable enough for heavy equipment to drive across them. These required telescoping legs that would rest on the seabed while the platform floated on the surface. Another technology that existed only on paper, completely untested under actual operating conditions. By autumn 1942, the concept was taking shape on drawing boards in a dozen British engineering firms, but it remained theoretical. No prototypes had been built. No tests had been conducted in actual sea conditions. And critically, no one had attempted to integrate all these separate components into a functional system. The skepticism was overwhelming. American engineers, reviewing British proposals in early 1943, were blunt in their assessment. The concept was too ambitious, the timeline too compressed, the engineering challenges too severe. Better to focus resources on proven methods, on capturing ports through conventional assault, on solving problems with solutions that had worked in previous wars. But British planners understood something American skeptics hadn't yet fully grasped. The Atlantic Wall had transformed coastal defense. German fortifications along the Channel represented the most heavily defended coastline in military history. 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel. 2 years of continuous construction by the Todd T organization, employing hundreds of thousands of forced laborers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had overseen improvements to the defenses through spring 1944, adding millions of mines, beach obstacles, and reinforced positions. The Germans believed, with considerable justification, that their Atlantic Wall made invasion impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. Any invasion force would need weeks to capture a major port, during which time German reserves could be concentrated to destroy the beachhead. This strategic certainty shaped all German defensive planning. They could afford to hold ports lightly defended in depth because they knew capturing one would take so long that reinforcements would arrive before the Allies could exploit any initial success. The Mulberry concept inverted this entire strategic calculation. If the Allies could bring their own ports, they wouldn't need to capture German fortifications. They could land on open beaches where defences were thinner. They could bypass the killing grounds Germany had so carefully prepared. They could establish supply lines independent of captured infrastructure. For this reason alone, the project received highest priority despite overwhelming technical challenges. In August 1943, the combined Chiefs of Staff issued formal approval. 2 artificial harbours would be constructed. Mulberry A would support American forces at Omaha Beach. Mulberry B would supply British and Canadian forces at Gold Beach. Each harbour needed to handle 12,000 tons of cargo daily in all weather conditions. They had to accommodate ships with 26-foot draft. They needed to remain operational for at least 90 days, long enough for Allied armies to capture and repair conventional ports. The specifications were finalized in September 1943. The timeline was brutal. All components needed to be manufactured, tested, assembled, and ready for deployment by May 1st, 1944. That gave British industry exactly 7 months to produce 2 complete artificial harbours from components that had never been built before, using designs that had never been tested under actual conditions, on a scale that exceeded any previous engineering project in British history. The Phoenix Caissons alone required staggering resources. 213 would be manufactured at 28 construction sites scattered around the British coast. They needed 330,000 cubic yards of concrete, 31,000 tons of steel reinforcing bar, 1.5 million yards of steel mesh. 45,000 workers would be employed on the project, competing for materials and labour with every other desperate priority of total war. The security requirements were absolute. German intelligence could not learn about the artificial harbours. If the enemy discovered the Allies planned to build their own ports, they might deduce the invasion would target beaches rather than fortified harbours. The entire security structure protecting Operation Overlord depended on maintaining the deception that Pas-de-Calais remained the primary target, precisely because it possessed the closest major ports to England. Construction began in October 1943 at locations throughout southern England. The scale was unprecedented. Some Phoenix caissons were built in dry docks, launched sideways into the water, then completed while floating. Others were constructed inland, with channels excavated to flood them. The East India Docks in London built 6 units. The Surrey Docks produced 12 more. Facilities at Portsmouth, Southampton, Plymouth, and 24 other locations worked simultaneously on components that would somehow need to fit together perfectly when assembled under fire on enemy-held beaches. The workers building these structures understood they were creating something important for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but security restrictions meant they couldn't know the true purpose. The Phoenix caissons were described as components for new harbours. Workers were told they were building replacements for bomb-damaged port facilities. The elaborate deception protected the secret, while 45,000 people laboured on the project. By early 1944, the first components were being launched and tested. The results were mixed. Some Phoenix caissons cracked during towing trials. Others proved difficult to manoeuvre even in calm water. The Whale roadways showed promising flexibility, but hadn't been tested under actual load in rough conditions. The Bombardon floating breakwaters, massive cruciform steel structures wrapped in rubberized canvas, worked well during calm weather trials, but no one knew how they'd perform in channel storms. The Lobnitz pier heads, designed to rise and fall with 26-foot tides, demonstrated the concept, but hadn't been tested at scale. Every component showed problems that required modifications, yet time was running out. The invasion date was approaching with inexorable momentum. By April 1944, much of the equipment remained incomplete. Construction delays plagued multiple sites. Weather hindered towing trials. Training for crews who would operate the harbours under combat conditions was minimal, and overseeing it all was the terrible knowledge that if the Mulberries failed, if they couldn't provide the promised logistical support, the entire invasion might collapse. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Without the artificial harbours, Operation Overlord planners calculated that Allied forces could hold the beachhead perhaps 2 weeks before ammunition shortages forced withdrawal. German reinforcements would arrive faster than the Allies could supply their armies over open beaches. The invasion would become another Dieppe, but on catastrophic scale, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and no possibility of trying again for years. Yet, even in May 1944, many senior officers remained skeptical. American commanders particularly doubted the Mulberries would work as promised. They requested that plans be developed for supplying forces directly over beaches, bypassing the artificial harbours entirely. This proved remarkably prescient given what would happen, but in spring 1944, it was treated as lack of faith in British engineering. The Germans, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of what was being prepared. Their intelligence services had failed catastrophically to detect the largest prefabricated construction project in history unfolding across southern England. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed unusual activity at various ports, but no German analyst connected the disparate observations into recognition of artificial harbour construction. The security deception held perfectly. When the invasion came, the artificial harbours would be a complete strategic surprise. German defensive planning continued to assume the Allies must capture a major port. This assumption shaped troop deployments, fortification priorities, reserve positioning, all the critical decisions that would determine whether the invasion succeeded or failed. The Germans prepared to defend ports that the Allies had no intention of attacking immediately. They concentrated forces in exactly the wrong locations based on strategic logic that British engineers had systematically undermined. The final assembly of components began in late May 1944. Phoenix caissons were towed from construction sites to assembly points at Selseybill and Dungeness. Blockships designated for scuttling were gathered at various ports. Whale roadways were connected into sections. Bombardment breakwaters were positioned. Hundreds of tugboats were assembled. Captains briefed on towing assignments. Crews trained in the complex procedures for positioning components under potential enemy fire. On June 5, with Operation Overlord postponed 24 hours due to weather, the Mulberry components waited in assembly areas, over 400 separate pieces weighing approximately 1.5 million tons in total. 2 complete artificial harbours, each the size of Dover, ready to be towed across the channel and assembled on enemy beaches. The largest prefabricated structures ever built, technology that existed nowhere in any military's arsenal except Britain's. Engineering that would either validate 2 years of desperate innovation or prove to be the most expensive failure in military history. The morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied soldiers stormed ashore on 5 Normandy beaches, the first tugboats began towing Mulberry components toward France. Behind the initial assault waves came convoys of vessels pulling Phoenix caissons at 3.5 knots, the massive concrete structures riding low in the water, crews watching nervously for German aircraft or submarines that might still threaten the crossing. No one knew if the harbours would work. No one knew if they could be assembled under combat conditions. No one knew if German counterattacks might destroy them before they became operational. But everyone understood that the success or failure of Operation Overlord might well depend on what happened in the next 2 weeks. If the Mulberry harbours could be built and operated as designed, the invasion would have the logistical foundation to sustain operations indefinitely. If they failed, the greatest amphibious assault in history might end in catastrophe. The German defenders watching those first Phoenix caissons arrive off Arromanches couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. It violated everything they'd been taught about military logistics and naval engineering, and that incomprehension would cost Germany any chance of throwing the invaders back into the sea before they established an unbreakable foothold in Fortress Europe. June 7, 1944. Dawn broke over the Normandy beaches, revealing a scene that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The initial assault waves had secured their objectives with casualties far lower than the most optimistic predictions at Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches. Even Omaha, where American forces had faced the fiercest resistance, was now firmly in Allied hands, despite the blood-soaked morning that had nearly ended in disaster. But the real work was only beginning. In the waters offshore, an armada of tugboats was methodically positioning the first components of the artificial harbours. The initial blockships of the Gooseberry breakwater system had begun arriving within hours of the landing. These were old merchantmen, obsolete warships, vessels that had served Britain well but were now designated for one final mission. They would be deliberately scuttled in predetermined positions to create the first line of protection for the artificial harbours. The sinking of the Gooseberries began on June 7th. Each ship was carefully positioned using survey markers that had been placed by brave hydrographers who had conducted reconnaissance missions in the months before D-Day. These survey teams had operated under extraordinary danger, approaching the enemy coast in darkness, taking soundings and measurements that would determine precisely where each component of the Mulberry harbours needed to be placed. Their work now proved invaluable, as the first blockships were manoeuvred into exact positions before being flooded and settled onto the channel bottom. The blockships created immediate shelter for smaller craft, but they were merely the foundation. The Phoenix caissons, those massive concrete structures that had consumed so much of Britain's industrial capacity, began arriving on June 8th. The first one was sunk at dawn off Arromanches, beginning the construction of Mulberry B. Tugboat crews worked with practiced efficiency, despite having almost no actual experience with structures of this size under combat conditions. The towing speed had been increased from the planned 3.5 knots to 4.5 knots to reduce the vulnerable time in transit. Even so, each Phoenix required nearly 20 hours to cross the channel, and there were 146 of them scheduled for delivery. The assembly process was remarkably swift, considering the unprecedented nature of the operation. By June 15th, 115 Phoenix caissons had been sunk into position off Arromanches, creating a 5-mile-long arc that stretched from Tracy-sur-Mer in the west to Asnelles in the east. The concrete wall rose from the seabed, creating a harbour where none had existed. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on top of the caissons, manned by American troops who would defend the harbour against Luftwaffe attacks that German commanders surely would order once they understood what was being constructed. Mulberry A, the American harbour off Omaha Beach at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, was progressing on a parallel schedule. Though American commanders had remained sceptical about the artificial harbour concept, they followed British procedures for assembly with only minor modifications. The Phoenix caissons were positioned, the Bombarden floating breakwaters were anchored offshore, and the whale roadways were being connected to Lobnitz pierheads that would allow Liberty ships to unload directly onto floating causeways leading to shore. On June 10th, the first LST, landing ship tank, dropped its ramp onto a completed pier section of Mulberry A. Within 2 days, 24,412 tons of supplies and ammunition had rolled ashore through the 2 artificial harbours. The system was working. Not perfectly. There were problems with the Bombarden breakwaters, which proved less stable than testing had suggested, and some of the whale roadways showed stress cracks from the constant flexing in channel waves. But overall, the Mulberries were performing their essential function, transforming open beaches into functioning ports capable of handling the enormous logistical demands of modern mechanized warfare. German reconnaissance finally photographed the harbours on June 12th. The images reached German High Command the following day, accompanied by intelligence assessments that struggled to explain what the photographs clearly showed. The Allies had somehow constructed complete harbour facilities on open beaches using prefabricated components transported across the channel. The concrete caissons alone represented an industrial achievement that German analysts had believed beyond Allied capacity, given the enormous demands of aircraft production, tank manufacturing, and all the other priorities of total war. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, received the reconnaissance reports with profound frustration. His entire defensive strategy had been predicated on the assumption that any invasion would require rapid capture of a major port. He had positioned his strongest reserves, the Panzer divisions, to counterattack toward Cherbourg or Le Havre, the ports closest to the invasion beaches. The artificial harbours invalidated this entire approach. The Allies didn't need to capture Cherbourg immediately. They could sustain operations indefinitely using their prefabricated ports. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Rommel ordered immediate air attacks against the Mulberry harbours. The Luftwaffe, already stretched desperately thin and operating under overwhelming Allied air superiority, attempted several raids. They achieved minimal success. The anti-aircraft defences proved formidable, and Allied fighters shot down most German aircraft before they could approach the harbours. More critically, even successful attacks that damaged individual components couldn't halt operations. The modular nature of the Mulberries meant that damaged sections could be replaced or repaired, while other parts continued functioning. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, studied the reconnaissance photographs with growing comprehension of their strategic implications. He understood immediately that the artificial harbours represented a technological solution to a problem German planners hadn't even recognized as solvable through engineering. In his personal diary, which would be recovered after the war, Speer wrote an assessment that captured the magnitude of Allied achievement with remarkable clarity. To construct our defences in 2 years, we used 13 million cubic metres of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel, Speer recorded. A fortnight after the landings by the enemy, this costly effort was brought to nothing because of an idea of simple genius. The Allies had built artificial harbours and constructed at Arromanches and Omaha on unprotected coast the necessary landing ramps. This admission, coming from the man who had overseen construction of the Atlantic Wall, represented complete recognition that German strategy had been fundamentally outthought. The billions of Reichsmarks spent on coastal fortifications, the years of labour, the elaborate defensive doctrine, all had been rendered largely irrelevant by British engineers, who simply bypassed the problem of capturing defended ports by bringing their own. But even as the Mulberries demonstrated their capability, disaster was approaching. The Channel weather, always unpredictable, was building toward the worst storm to hit the Normandy coast in 40 years. Meteorologists had noticed the pressure systems developing on June 17th, but no one anticipated the severity of what was coming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 19th, 1944. The storm arrived with winds reaching force 6 on the Beaufort scale, generating waves that attacked the artificial harbours with devastating force. The weather that had concerned General Eisenhower when he'd made the decision to launch the invasion on June 6th had returned with vengeance that exceeded the worst forecasts. For 3 days and nights, the storm pounded the Normandy coast with fury that would have been remarkable even in winter, but was unprecedented for mid-June. The bombardon floating breakwaters, those massive cruciform steel structures that formed the outer protective line, began to fail first. Some broke up and sank outright. Others parted their hemp rope moorings and drifted down onto the inner harbours, their heavy steel structures crashing into the Phoenix caissons and whale roadways with destructive force. The flexible roadways that had performed so well in moderate seas began to twist and buckle under the relentless waves. Sections broke free from their moorings. Pontoons capsized or flooded. Landing craft were thrown against the piers, damaging both vessels and harbour structures. At Mulberry A, the American harbour off Omaha Beach, the damage escalated catastrophically. The Americans had anchored their harbour components less securely than the British had at Arromanches, a decision made to speed initial assembly and allow repositioning if needed. Under storm conditions, this proved fatal. Entire sections of the harbour broke loose. Phoenix caissons shifted from their positions. The whale roadways twisted into wreckage. By June 22nd, when the storm finally began to abate, Mulberry A was a mass of twisted steel and broken concrete. American engineers surveyed the damage and concluded the harbour was beyond practical repair. The loss of Mulberry A represented a severe setback to Allied logistics. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces in Normandy, faced the prospect of supplying his entire army directly over the open beaches, using the methods that had been employed before the artificial harbours became operational. The logistics staff calculated that supplies would be reduced to a fraction of planned capacity. Bradley's forces had only 3 days of ammunition left. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's British Second Army was 3 divisions behind in its landing schedule, because ships designated for British beaches had been diverted to replace American losses. Yet the build-up continued. American engineers, working with remarkable ingenuity under desperate conditions, improvised solutions. They brought landing ships directly to shore, deliberately grounding them on the beaches during high tide, offloading cargo, then refloating the vessels on the next high tide. It was inefficient compared to proper harbour operations, but it worked. And critically, salvageable components from the wrecked Mulberry A were towed to Arromanches to reinforce Mulberry B, which had survived the storm, though not without significant damage. The British harbour at Arromanches had been anchored more securely to the seabed, and this proved the margin between survival and destruction. Though individual components failed, the overall structure remained intact. British engineers worked through the storm to make emergency repairs, securing loose sections, replacing damaged roadways, reinforcing weak points. When the weather cleared on June 22nd, Mulberry B was battered but functional. The harbour that had been planned to operate for 90 days would ultimately remain in service for 10 months, far exceeding its design specifications. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, as Allied armies broke out from the Normandy beachhead and drove across France, Mulberry B continued operations. By October 1944, when the Allied advance had captured Antwerp and opened new supply lines through Belgian ports, 25% of supplies, 20% of reinforcements, and 15% of vehicles were still landing through the artificial harbour at Arromanches. The final statistics were staggering. In the 10 months after D-Day, Mulberry B was used to land over 2.5 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. These numbers represented the difference between success and failure, between establishing a sustainable campaign and conducting another costly raid that would be thrown back into the sea. The artificial harbour had provided exactly what its designers had promised, a functioning port on an open beach that could sustain major military operations indefinitely. The German response to the Mulberry harbours evolved from initial disbelief through gradual recognition to final bitter acknowledgement. In the immediate aftermath of D-Day, German commanders had convinced themselves that the invasion could still be defeated. They believed that once Rommel's panzer reserves were committed effectively, the Allied beachhead could be destroyed before it was consolidated. The artificial harbours shattered this hope. They demonstrated that the Allies could supply their forces at rates that German intelligence had calculated were impossible without capturing a major port. By July 1944, German staff officers were circulating internal assessments that acknowledged the strategic situation had become hopeless in Normandy. The Allies possessed overwhelming material superiority. They controlled the skies completely, preventing German daylight movement. They had unlimited access to fresh troops and equipment through their artificial harbours and captured ports. German forces were being ground down in attritional battles they couldn't win. The artificial harbours hadn't just enabled the invasion, they had made Allied victory inevitable by ensuring that supplies would never become a limiting factor. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who would briefly succeed Hitler as head of state in the war's final days, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the artificial harbours with grudging professional respect. The Mulberries represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking that German military planning had failed to anticipate. German engineers had been capable of building similar structures, Dönitz acknowledged, but it had never occurred to German staff officers that such technology might be necessary or practical. The failure was one of imagination rather than technical capability. This failure of imagination extended throughout the German command structure. Even after reconnaissance confirmed the existence of the artificial harbours, many German officers refused to believe they could work reliably. They convinced themselves the structures would fail during the first serious storm, that they were temporary expedients that couldn't sustain major operations. When the storm of June 19th destroyed Mulberry A, German propaganda seized on this as proof that Allied technology had failed. Radio broadcasts proclaimed that the invasion's logistical foundation had collapsed, that Allied forces would soon be starving for ammunition and supplies. This propaganda convinced no one who actually examined the evidence. Mulberry B had survived and was operating at near full capacity. American forces were being supplied effectively despite losing their artificial harbour, proving that multiple redundant supply methods existed. And most critically, the storm had revealed that even total destruction of the artificial harbours wouldn't halt Allied operations. The beaches themselves could handle sufficient throughput, though at reduced efficiency. By August 1944, when Allied forces broke out from the Normandy beachhead in Operation Cobra, German commanders understood that the artificial harbours had been merely one component, albeit a crucial one, of overwhelming Allied logistical superiority. American industry was producing equipment faster than German forces could destroy it. British manufacturing had somehow found capacity to build 2 complete artificial harbours while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and all the other materiel of modern war. The industrial disparity between the Allies and Germany had become so vast that no amount of tactical skill or defensive doctrine could compensate. The lessons of the Mulberry harbours extended far beyond their immediate military impact. They demonstrated that engineering innovation could overcome obstacles that appeared insurmountable through conventional military solutions. They proved that prefabricated modular construction could create functional infrastructure under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They validated the concept that logistical preparation was as important as tactical planning for successful amphibious operations, and they showed that taking enormous calculated risks on unproven technology could pay strategic dividends that more conservative approaches would never achieve. The human cost of developing and deploying the Mulberries was substantial, though often overlooked in histories focused on combat operations. 3 workers died during construction when a Phoenix Caisson launch went out of control at Stokes Bay, collapsing the launchway and trapping men beneath thousands of tons of concrete. Others were injured in industrial accidents across the 28 construction sites. Tugboat crews faced constant danger during the channel crossings, vulnerable to mines, submarines, and air attack, while towing massive structures that limited maneuverability. Engineers working to assemble the harbours under fire at Normandy were killed by artillery, snipers, and bombing attacks. Yet these casualties, though tragic, were minuscule compared to what would have been lost if the invasion had failed for lack of logistical support. Military historians have calculated that the Mulberry harbours, by ensuring adequate supply to Allied forces during the critical first months after D-Day, may have shortened the war in Europe by a year or more. That year would have cost hundreds of thousands of additional military casualties and millions of additional civilian deaths as the Nazi regime continued its genocidal policies for another 12 months. The broader implications of the Mulberry concept influenced amphibious warfare planning for decades after the war. The United States military, initially skeptical of the artificial harbours, became the world's leading proponent of modular portable infrastructure for expeditionary operations. Modern amphibious assault doctrine assumes that forces can be supplied over unimproved beaches using rapidly deployable infrastructure. The concepts pioneered by the Mulberries evolved into the roll-on roll-off ship designs, the floating piers, and the modular causeway systems that remain standard equipment for amphibious forces worldwide. The Phoenix Caissons themselves had lives extending far beyond their wartime service. After the war, many were left where they'd been sunk, considered too large and too difficult to salvage economically. The remnants at Arromanches remain visible today at low tide, concrete monuments to the engineering that made D-Day possible. Other caissons were sold to countries needing emergency infrastructure. The Netherlands purchased several to repair breaches in dikes damaged during the war. 4 Phoenix caissons were used after the catastrophic North Sea flood of 1953, plugging gaps at Ouwerkerk. These 4 have since been converted into a museum commemorating the flood. Iceland purchased surplus caissons for breakwater construction at Akranes. Sweden bought 2 and used them for harbour infrastructure. Several remain in British waters, including 2 at Portland Harbour that were designated Grade 2 listed monuments in 1993, protected for their historical significance. 1 broken Phoenix lies beached in the Thames estuary off Shoeburyness, broken in 2 after its towing cable parted in June 1944. It serves as a navigation hazard marker, topped by a beacon warning ships of its presence. The designers and engineers who created the Mulberry harbours received recognition, though perhaps less than their achievement warranted. Alan Beckett, who designed the flexible Whale roadways, continued his engineering career after the war and was eventually knighted for his contributions. Brigadier Bruce White, who commanded the engineers responsible for building the harbours, received the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Commodore John Hughes Hallett, whose experience at Dieppe had sparked the artificial harbour concept, had a distinguished post-war naval career. Yet many of the 45,000 workers who built the components remained anonymous, their contribution to victory unrecognised beyond the satisfaction of having participated in something historic. The tugboat captains who towed the Phoenix caissons across the channel under threat of enemy attack received no special decoration beyond standard service medals. The hydrographers who conducted the dangerous pre-invasion surveys that determined where each component should be placed were mentioned only in classified reports that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The contrast with more famous engineering projects like the atomic bomb is instructive. The Manhattan Project, which developed nuclear weapons, has been exhaustively documented. The scientists involved became household names. Their work has been analysed in countless books and films. The Mulberry harbours, which arguably contributed more directly to Allied victory by ensuring the invasion succeeded, remain relatively obscure, except among military historians and engineering specialists. Perhaps this is because the harbours were too successful. They worked so well that their crucial role became invisible. If Mulberry B had failed completely, forcing a logistical crisis that threatened the invasion, its importance would be unmistakable. Because it succeeded in providing exactly the capacity promised, enabling operations to continue without interruption, the achievement seemed almost routine in hindsight. The final accounting of the Mulberry harbour's contribution to victory must consider both what they accomplished and what their existence prevented. They delivered 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies to Normandy. These raw numbers, impressive as they are, don't fully capture the strategic impact. More important was the certainty they provided to Allied planners that logistics wouldn't constrain operations. Generals could plan offensive operations knowing supplies would be available when needed. They didn't need to husband ammunition or ration fuel because the Mulberry harbours ensured steady flow of materiel. This psychological dimension of assured supply affected German planning as much as Allied operations. German commanders understood that attempting to strangle Allied supply lines through interdiction was futile. The artificial harbours, combined with captured ports and direct beach supply, created such enormous redundancy that no realistic amount of German counteraction could meaningfully constrain Allied logistics. This knowledge affected every tactical decision, every defensive plan, every assessment of whether particular operations were worth attempting. The artificial harbours also prevented what the Germans most needed, a prolonged pause in Allied operations while supply problems were resolved. German strategy after D-Day depended on buying time to move reinforcements from other fronts, time to rebuild shattered divisions, time to construct new defensive lines, time to develop the jet aircraft and advanced submarines and other wonder weapons that German propaganda insisted would turn the tide. The Mulberries ensured that the Allies never granted that time. Operations continued without pause from the initial landings through the breakout, across France, to the borders of Germany itself. In the post-war period, as the Cold War developed and new military challenges emerged, the lessons of the Mulberry harbours were studied exhaustively by military planners. The United States, particularly, with its global commitments requiring potential amphibious operations in theatres lacking developed port infrastructure, invested heavily in portable harbour technology. The U.S. Army developed improved causeway systems. The Navy created specialised vessels designed to facilitate over-the-beach logistics. The concept pioneered in desperation by British engineers facing the Dieppe disaster became standard doctrine for American expeditionary warfare. The Soviet Union, studying Allied operations in Normandy, drew different lessons. They concluded that properly defended coastlines were essentially impregnable against amphibious assault, regardless of artificial harbour technology. Soviet defensive doctrine emphasized coastal fortification and counterattack by operational reserves. They misread the Mulberry lesson, focusing on the defensive failures that allowed the invasion rather than the logistical innovation that made it sustainable. This misunderstanding would affect Soviet military planning through the Cold War decades. Modern amphibious operations continue to reflect Mulberry principles. The U.S. military maintains large inventories of modular causeway sections that can be assembled to create floating piers in any theatre. These are direct descendants of Alan Beckett's Whale roadways, using the same concepts of flexible bridging units mounted on floating pontoons. The technology has advanced, materials have improved, but the fundamental design approach remains recognizable as an evolution of the wartime artificial harbours. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. The story of the Mulberry harbours transcends their immediate military purpose to reveal broader truths about innovation under extreme pressure. British engineers had approximately 7 months to design, test, and produce technology that had never existed before at a scale that seemed impossible. They succeeded because failure meant invasion, defeat, and continued Nazi domination of Europe. The stakes compelled innovation that peacetime would have taken decades to develop. This pattern, crisis forcing rapid development of revolutionary technology, would characterize much of 20th century engineering. The artificial harbours also demonstrated the importance of learning from failure. The Dieppe disaster, which killed or captured thousands of Canadian soldiers in a few horrific hours, generated the crucial insight that ports couldn't be captured through direct assault against determined resistance. That painful lesson, absorbed and acted upon, led to the development of technology that made the successful invasion possible. Organizations that learn from failure and adapt their approaches accordingly gain decisive advantages over those that simply repeat failed strategies. Finally, the Mulberry story reveals how technological innovation can fundamentally alter strategic calculations in ways that surprise even sophisticated opponents. The Germans weren't stupid. Their intelligence services were professional and competent. Their military engineers were among the world's best. Yet they completely failed to anticipate that the Allies might solve the port problem through prefabricated artificial harbour construction. This failure stemmed partly from limited imagination, partly from overconfidence in their own Atlantic Wall defences, and partly from simple inability to conceive that British industry could produce such massive infrastructure while fighting total war. The Phoenix Caissons, standing off Arromanches today, serve as monuments to human ingenuity deployed in desperate circumstances. They represent the triumph of engineering over strategic constraints, the victory of innovation over conventional limitation. They embody the determination of free societies to outthink authoritarian opponents through technical superiority and imaginative problem-solving. And they stand as permanent reminders that the most formidable obstacles can be overcome when brilliant minds address crucial problems with unlimited commitment to success. When Albert Speer admitted that Allied ingenuity had brought to nothing 2 years of German fortification construction through an idea of simple genius, he was acknowledging more than defeat in a particular engineering competition. He was recognizing that the Allies had fundamentally outthought German strategic planning. The artificial harbours weren't just clever devices. They were proof that free inquiry, unrestricted by ideological constraints, fostered innovation that authoritarian systems couldn't match. German engineers might have built similar structures if ordered, but no German planner conceived the possibility because their rigid doctrine didn't encourage the kind of radical rethinking that British engineers embraced after Dieppe. This lesson resonates beyond military history into broader questions about innovation, creativity, and problem-solving. Organizations that encourage challenging assumptions, that reward innovative thinking even when it contradicts established doctrine, that create space for unconventional approaches to difficult problems. These organizations develop capabilities that surprise competitors and overcome obstacles others consider insurmountable. The Mulberry harbours succeeded because British engineering culture in 1943 embraced exactly this kind of radical innovation under extreme pressure. The workers who built the Phoenix Caissons, the sailors who towed them across the Channel, the engineers who assembled them under fire on Normandy beaches, all contributed to technology that ensured Allied victory in the largest and most consequential amphibious operation in human history. Their work, sustained through hardship and danger, created the logistical foundation for liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. That achievement, measured in millions of lives saved and hundreds of millions freed from totalitarian rule, stands as one of engineering's greatest contributions to human welfare. The artificial harbours at Normandy worked because they embodied the same qualities that characterized successful Allied strategy throughout the Second World War: technical innovation, industrial capacity, operational flexibility, and absolute determination to overcome any obstacle between present circumstances and final victory. These qualities, combined with the blood and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought ashore, ensured that the invasion succeeded and that Nazi Germany's defeat became inevitable. The concrete caissons, visible at low tide off the French coast, remain as testaments to what can be achieved when engineering excellence serves moral purpose with uncompromising commitment to success against overwhelming odds. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.